Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest of our virtual Masters Lodge events. And I'm here at Selwyn tonight, and our special guest is Professor David Dabydeen, who is a writer, an academic, a diplomat, and most important for us, a Selwyn alumnus and one of our newest honorary fellows. And this event, which is organised with help of the JCR, is part of our marking of Black History Month. And David's going to talk for about 15 minutes on what he calls the first Black Lives Matter movement. I'll then interview him about some of the points he's raised, and I may also try to slip in a couple of questions about his own extraordinary life. And then we are going to open the questions via chat, and you can put your questions, or I will put the questions on your behalf to Professor Dabydeen. So without any more ado, David Dabydeen, good evening.
Hi, Roger. Thanks very much for inviting me to this occasion. And I've taken it seriously enough to make some notes and not to just waffle. I wanted to focus on the abolition movement. Why? For two reasons. First of all, it's been taken over by people who've made hypocritical statements about abolition. People, political leaders saying, patting Britain on the back, patting themselves on the back, saying, we abolished slavery, quite forgetting to mention also that we started it and ran it successfully for 250 years. In 1562, Sir John Hawkins set off on his first journey to capture Africans. He fought 300 and then traded them in North America, and we know tons of money made between 1562 and 1838 when slavery was abolished. We know, for example, just a little example, at the end of the 17th century, Liverpool was a relatively insignificant fishing village, but by the end of the 18th century, it was a major European port. So I wanted to talk about the importance of abolition. The other reason I wanted to talk about abolition is that the early historians quite neglected to mention that the abolition movement was also driven by black slaves, the enslaved black people in the Caribbean, who every year, hundreds and hundreds of, over the centuries, hundreds and hundreds of slavery votes, which made slavery unmanageable. Indeed, in 1831, December 1831-32, you had a massive slave rebellion in Jamaica, which was so horrendous that that it really, Parliament hastened to pass the Abolition Act. Anyway, if you take a right, if you go out to Selwyn and take a right on Grange Road and walk down Grange Road and cross the road, the first left street that you will meet is Clarkson Street. And if you walk down Clarkson Street and you get to the top of the road, that's called Wilberforce Road. Clarkson and Wilberforce obviously were main abolitionists, major abolitionists. So in a sense, geographically, Selwyn is geographically placed in the area of slavery. But morally, ethically, Cambridge was part of the center of the abolition movement. I know that Cambridge is now doing research on how it may have benefited from benefactions from slave owners and plantation owners, but certainly in the 18th century and from the 1780s onwards, Cambridge was at the center of abolition. You had the vice chancellor himself, Peter Peckard, was a major abolitionist and always welcomed people like Clarkson and people like Oluda Equiano and other abolitionists to Cambridge, give lectures. Clarkson himself, probably the greatest abolitionist, a Cambridge man, St. John's. Coleridge in 1792 won the Brown Gold Medal for writing a Greek ode against the slave trade, again a Cambridge man, and of course Wilberforce from St. John's College. The Clapham sect, which was very progressive, scholars and clergymen and activists. The Clapham sect really was dominated by Cambridge people. I quote Stephen Tompkins, who said, it was a network of friends and families in England with William Wilberforce at its center of gravity, who were powerfully bound together by their shared moral and spiritual values. So I want, I think it may already be that people have written about Cambridge and its relationship to the slave trade and subsequently indentureship, but I just wanted to mention that at the very beginning. The second Black Lives Matter movement started in 2020 with the killing of, with violence done upon the black body, that of Floyd. The first Black Lives Matter movement also started as a result of violence done upon the black body. In 1765, a young 17-year-old black boy, formerly a slave in Barbados, was brought to England by his master. His name was Jonathan Strong, and he foolishly got himself baptized secretly, because there was a feeling among black people at the time, who were legally slaves in England, that if you got baptized, you automatically be, and you were a Christian. In fact, the three legal judgments that I know of in the 18th century definitely said that slavery didn't affect the condition, that baptism did not affect the condition of slavery. Anyway, Jonathan Strong, almost certainly as a result of getting himself baptized, was beaten very badly by his master, very, very badly, and thrown out into the streets I don't know. Was taken to a doctor's surgery, Dr. Sharp, who was a doctor well known for looking after the poor, deeply religious man. And I'll talk about religion later and the role that religion played in abolition. Dr. Sharp was a deeply religious man and was famous for looking after poor people. So he looked after Jonathan Strong, and Dr. Sharp's brother, Granville Sharp, who became the major abolitionist with Wilberforce in the 18th century, happened to be at the surgery at the time and met Jonathan Strong. And was so shocked by the condition of Jonathan Strong that he then decided on the spot to really do something about the condition of black people. And so they sent Jonathan Strong to hospital. They looked after him, fed him, sent him to hospital, and then found him a job after 4.5 months of treatment. Found him a job as an errand boy for an apothecary. And this is what Jonathan Strong wrote about Granville Sharp and the Sharp brothers. He said, "I could hardly walk or see my way where I was going. When I came to him and he saw me in that condition, the gentleman take charity of me and gave me some stoof to wash my eyes with and some money to get myself a little necessaries until the next day. The next day after, I come to the gentleman and he sent me to the hospital. And I was there 4 months and a half. All the while I was in the hospital, the gentleman fined me clothes, shoes, and stockings. And when I come out, he paid for my lodgings and the money to find myself some necessaries till he gets me into a place." Granville Sharp decided to spend the rest of his life. He was a minor civil servant. He was nobody in the social hierarchy. He was a minor civil servant. Lucky enough to have a brother who was a doctor who could help him financially. He decided to spend the rest of his life studying law from scratch so that he could represent black people in court who had the same issues that Jonathan Strong had. And Professor James Baldwin, who is the major British scholar studying slavery, wrote about Jonathan Strong episode. He said, "The encounter with a badly beaten Jonathan Strong and the relationship that ensued changed not only the life of Granville Sharp, but the course of British history. For it was encountering Jonathan Strong that so profoundly affected Granville Sharp that he devoted the rest of his life to working with the Black community in London to campaign for the abolition of the slave trade and then of slavery itself. So this is a major moment in British history, which I think we ought to, I'd love if we can know more about it, because it's something creative, positive. It reminds me that there are some really great human beings motivated by their religion, who sacrifice their lives really to fight on behalf of enslaved Black people. Sharp represented other people, Black people, in court, and in 1772 he really made history when he defended a Black man called James Somerset, who was a slave in Virginia, enslaved in Virginia, and brought by his master in 1771 to Britain. And what Somerset did was, as soon as he arrived in England, he ran away. He ran off and hid. And he hid successfully from his master for 2 months. I mean, it's really hard to run away and hide when you're Black. You know, obviously people notice you. How did he manage 2 months of escape? Very simply, poor white people helped him. We know from the evidence of Sir John Fielding, a white magistrate, one of the most famous magistrates in the 18th century. He said it was really difficult, in fact dangerous, for masters to try to recover their Black slaves, runaway slaves, because the mob defended them. He actually used the word the mob with a capital M. By the mob, he means the laboring poor, who actually protected Black people when they ran away. We know from the Prince of William Hogarth and Gilray and Rowlandson that the white poor and Black people begged together in the streets. They were prostitutes together in the taverns and brothels. They were fairground performers together, and so on and so forth. So it was very difficult to recover. This is why James Somerset was able to hang out for escape for 2 months before being caught. I want to read you just very, very briefly, what's called a hue and cry advertisement. Many hue and cry advertisements in the 18th century newspapers, offering reward for runaway blacks like James Somerset. I'll just read one. This is the 1770s from the newspaper. Runaway from Captain Stubbs, a yellowish Negro man. I don't know what a yellowish Negro man would look like. Perhaps he had jaundice. A yellowish Negro man, about 5 foot 7 inches, very fat nose, and a scar across his forehead. He had when he ran away. He had when he ran away a white pea jacket, a pair of black stockings, and a black wig. Whoever will bring said Negro man to his above-mentioned master, Captain Stubbs, in Princess Square, Ratcliffe Highway, to receive 2 guineas reward. That's quite a lot of money in those days. And then it says, NB, the above-mentioned master, Captain Stubbs, desires that no commander, merchants, or any other gentleman will employ the above-mentioned Negro. He goes by the name of Stephen Brown, and if he will return to his master, nothing will be done to him. Well, I don't think that's quite true. Something would have been done to him when he returned to his master. Anyway, to come back to James Somerset and this extraordinary decision in 1772, they recaptured James Somerset, packed him in on a boat which was about to sail to the West Indies, where he would be resold into slavery. Granville Sharp hustled and managed to get a writ to release James Somerset. And then a court case ensued, a major court case, one of the longest court cases in the 18th century. It lasted for 5 months before the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield. And Granville Sharp, who had studied law, specifically for a moment like this, had a battery of lawyers on his side, all pro bono, working pro bono for 5 months. James Somerset, slave owner, had a lot of finance from from the pro-slavery lobby for his legal defense. Anyway, on the 22nd of June, 1772, the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield, made the landmark decision that a black slave in Britain could not be forcibly removed from Britain, and that it was up to Parliament to rule on the legality of slavery in Britain. You can imagine there's no law about slavery in Britain. There are laws about slavery in the British colonies, but you know, the legality of the black people in Britain were slaves legally, but that was a judgment that could be challenged. And Lord Mansfield's landmark judgment on the 22nd of June, 1772, was the beginning of the ending of the slave trade and of slavery itself. By the way, the 22nd of June, 1772, on the 22nd of June, 1948, that's when the Windrush docked in Tilbury. And as you know, Windrush Day is the 22nd of June every year. Granville Sharp then went on to do something magnificent. He set up a society for the abolition of the slave trade, 1787. Basically, Roger, it was 12 disciples of Christ who sat around the table and decided we have to do something because of our religious conviction. Those were the days when Christians were Christians, you know, these were pre-Darwinian days before God was shifted to one side and natural selection replaced a lot of religion. These people, when they were Christians, were really serious Christians. You probably remember in 1780, the biggest riots in the history of London took place in 1780, the Gordon riots, 7 days of anti-Catholic riots. Chapels burned down, people beaten up, over 300 people, if not more, killed. So that's how seriously people took religion. And these 12 Christians who sat around the table and decided to set up society for the abolition of the slave trade, it was a very first formal body, a campaign in Parliament for the ending of the slave trade, and then eventually the ending of slavery itself. Two of the prime movers who came when I mentioned already, Thomas Clarkson. Thomas Clarkson, believe it or not, rode on his horse 35,000 miles all across Britain to collect petitions, interview sailors. He interviewed about 20,000 sailors. He spent all his life really riding from city to city, from port to port, to such an extent that he was such a nuisance that when he arrived in Liverpool, I can't remember exactly what date, the pro-slavery lobby paid people to assassinate him. You can imagine if you're making tons of money and somebody comes into your place, riding on horseback, as it were, literally, and tries to preach against your sources of your income. You can imagine that people would want to kill him, and they tried to kill him, but he managed to escape. He interviewed 20,000 people. He did pamphlets. He distributed pamphlets. As I said, he went all over Britain. He introduced Oluda Equiano, the black writer, and I mentioned him later on, to Peter Peckard in Cambridge. Oluda Equiano then settled in Cambridge as one of the major abolitionists. In fact, his daughter is buried in the church in Chester. Wordsworth said of Clarkson, he was, quote, a firm friend of humankind. And I think that's that's understating the genius and the extraordinary nature of this great Cambridge alumnus. I really have anyway. You had backing the Society for the Abolition of Slavery. All great social movements need to be marketed, don't they? You know, need money in marketing. And who did they have? The greatest marketing person in the whole of the 18th century, without a shadow of a doubt, Josiah Wedgwood. Josiah Wedgwood funded, supported abolition in a major way. He did it by giving the abolition movement what they really needed. He gave them a logo. He created a medallion of a black slave kneeling with his hands in supplication in chains. He gave them that logo. You need an image, don't you? He gave them a motto. All great social movements need a motto. The motto was, "Am I not a man and a brother?" So you have the slavery medallion, and underneath you have the motto, "Am I not a man and a brother?" A really important catchphrase. Am I not a man? The slavery is justified at the time that Black people were not quite, they were really low in the chain of being. They were not quite human. They were descendants of Ham rather than, you know, from some central patriarchal figure. And am I not a man? Really important. And then a brother, which echoes, you know, we are our brother's keeper, and one to others and so on. Very Christian image. It actually alludes to the iconography of Mary at the foot of the cross, in agony at the death of her son. But you know what Wedgwood did? Miss Wedgwood, by the way, was famous for creating markets. He was the first person to invent buy one, get one free. He was the first one to say, buy and you can bring it back and I'll replace it. These kind of modern marketing tools Wedgwood used. He also created catalogs, which created great excitement, you know, like Argos catalogs, right? He was the Argos catalog man of his time, major exporter. What he did for the abolition movement, apart from creating a logo and a motto, he did merchandising, the equivalent of T-shirts. So that medallion of the kneeling man was put. The image was put in brooches, snuff boxes, plates, cups, ordinary utensils. So everybody, it was hard to escape that image of the black man kneeling, and saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" He was a great marketeer. He was a great marketing man, Josiah Wedgwood. And you know, his brother, his wife, his children poured lots and lots of money into the abolition movement. Wedgwood at the time was the equivalent, I suppose, of a billionaire today. You know, another man I should mention who was very important in the abolition movement was John Newton. John Newton, we know today, is the creator of one of the greatest English hymns, Amazing Grace. But in 1788, he published a pamphlet on his former experience of being a slave ship captain. He converted and became a reverend. But he wrote in his pamphlet about he described the interior of the slave ship in an extraordinary manner. It's an amazing image. He said, "The blacks lie in 2 rows, one above the other, like books upon a shelf. I have known the shelf packed so tightly that it could not easily contain one more." That's an amazing image of a body of texts, unwritten texts, being shipped over from Africa to the Caribbean, awaiting to be written, and were eventually written by some of our great Caribbean writers and African writers and so on. But so John Newton. This was an extraordinary image of the slave ship as a library, reminding us as well that some of the planters and owners of slaves are also very learned people. Oluda Equiano, not very well known. In 1789, he published his autobiography. It went through 9 editions. It was the first time people were reading a book written actually by a former slave. So he traveled up and down the country, including in Cambridge, where he stayed for quite a while, attracting huge crowds and selling thousands upon thousands of copies of his book, which helped also to fund the abolition movement. Equiano was so important that the last book that Wesley read before he died was Equiano's autobiography. He was a major black figure in British abolitionist circles. Thousands, as I said, would turn up to his meeting. In fact, I think I just made a note here. When he went to Ireland, he sold 1,900 copies. I mean, when you think the readership was very small at the time, half the country was illiterate, the other half was, the other 25% semi-literate. So to sell thousands of copies was quite an achievement. So that's Equiano. And of course, the great Wilberforce, who fronted the abolition movement and got people to send in thousands and thousands of petitions, hundreds of petitions to Parliament, containing hundreds of thousands of signatures. Hundreds of thousands of people signed who never saw a black person, only heard these abolitionists talking about the horrors of slavery. They put their names to petitions. In 1814, 1,375,000 people signed petitions. I mean, that's amazing when you think that at the time, I think England only had about 9 million people. Anyway, 1,375,000 people in 1814. And before then, hundreds of petitions sent to Parliament. There were some serious setbacks to the abolition movement. It was the most serious and the most tragic and comic at the same time was in 1796 when William Wilberforce, I think it was the third reading of the bill in the House of Lords, the third reading of the bill in the House of Lords for the abolition of the slave trade. It was being read for the third time in 1796. And Wilberforce, in his diaries, says that he was completely convinced that he would win the vote because he had enough support. But unfortunately, when the night came for them to vote, 4 of his supporters went to an opera instead. There was an opera in London called The Two Hunchbacks. Two Hunchbacks, which was very popular in Italian comic opera. And they went to the opera, as simple as that, and they didn't vote. And so therefore the bill did not pass. The Wilberforce said in his diary that it made him ill. I think he went through a kind of nervous breakdown because of the Two Hunchbacks. I would love to find the libretto and the music of the Two Hunchbacks and play Cambridge musicians to perform it. But there it is, an opera in 1796. Black people had to wait until 1807 before the slave trade ended. So that's what, 11 years. That's on average 80,000 Africans shipped over. So that's nearly 1 million Africans were enslaved between 1796 and 1807 because of the opera, the Two Hunchbacks. I want to end by saying that even when slavery ended in 1838, people in Britain continued to campaign for abolition elsewhere in the world, in Brazil, in America, because in America, abolition didn't come until the end of the Civil War in 1865. Many fugitive black slaves from America came to Britain, funded by the abolitionists. And I'll mention one in particular before I end. I'll just mention, for example, 3 people who came, who were very well known at the time. Charles Redmond, they're all men. Charles Redmond, in 1840, he obtained petitions signed by 60,000 Irish people when he came to England. 60,000 Irish people wrote petitions so that Charles Redmond could take it back to America. These were petitions urging their fellow Irish countrymen to support abolition. Frederick Douglass, probably the most famous of black abolitionists, he sold 13,000 copies of his autobiography in 1845 to 1847. I mean, 13,000, extraordinary. And the enormous reception he received, enormous reception, crowds that reached him. William Wells Brown, another fugitive slave, traveled to England in the 1850s. 12,000 miles he traveled within Britain, speaking to over 1,000 meetings, and he sold 12,000 copies of his book. I want to end by paying tribute to one of the great funders, apart from Wedgwood, somebody who played a major part in funding these abolitionists, because it costs money to bring them over, it costs money to feed them, it costs money to come to various meetings, it costs money to hire the meeting halls. It was, it was a financial debt, really. It was, money was involved. one of the people who really funded the abolitionists after, fighting for freedom in America was Jonathan Carr. Carr's biscuits, Carr's wafers, wafer thin biscuits. I think everybody knows Carr's biscuits, don't they? Well, Jonathan Carr set up a bakery in 1831. Again, moved deeply. He was a Quaker. He was moved deeply by his Christian belief. He set up a bakery in Carlisle in 1831, and within 25 years, by 1855, it was Britain's biggest baking business. And that money from biscuits and cakes, I think it was biscuits mostly, crackers, funded the abolition, helped to fund a major part of the abolition movement in America. So, Roger, I think I've spoken for too long, haven't I?
It's been perfect, David.
I'll keep quiet now, and please feel free to interrogate me on anything I've said.
Well, David, thank you for touching on some terrible stories, but also noting that the forces for social justice do exist as well. We may come back to your own life later. I just want to touch on one bit of your family history, though, which is that after slavery was abolished, there was then a system called indentureship, which was described by some people as being really a new system of slavery. But your great-great-grandfather was one of the people in indentureship. So maybe just briefly tell us about that. Yes,
after slavery ended in 1838, Sir John Gladstone, who owned slave estates in the Caribbean, in Guyana, my own country, thought that there would be a labor shortage, that the black people emancipated would just run away from the plantations. So he decided to preempt that possible labor shortage by shipping thousands of Indians over to Guyana, 500,000 really in all. So John Gladstone was the father of Ewart Gladstone, the Prime Minister. So he started the scheme of indentureship, shipping thousands of Indians from Calcutta mostly to the Guyanese plantations. And those early Indians were called Gladstone Coolies. So at least they had a title. And so that system of indentureship lasted from 1838 to 1920. A lot of the money made from slavery and indentureship still exists. You just have to go to Bristol and Liverpool and so on. There's still tons of money still in existence. And whilst I don't necessarily believe in reparations in terms of handing money over, complicated for me to understand. I think that's a matter of government speaking to governments. I really love the idea of reparations being, let us learn something about Black British history, or let us learn something about this major movement in Britain called slavery and abolition. In other words, when we talk about decolonizing the curriculum, it's not a horrible thing. It's not life-threatening, It's just saying the things that I've just mentioned should be knowledgeable to more people, The abolition movement, I forgot to say, was the first and largest mass philanthropic movement in Britain. A mass philanthropic movement, way before temperance, which succeeded it. How can you not learn about the first mass philanthropic movement in Britain? So that's what decolonizing the curriculum, for me, that's reparations.
David, we should note that you're working with Selwyn at the moment on a possible academic post on indentureship. So if you want to know anything more about that, do contact, probably the easiest thing is to contact me, master@cell.cam.ac.uk, but we'll give you more details, or contact the alumni office, and maybe we'll come back to that before the end. What I was going to ask you, though, when you talk about reparations and so on, I grew up in a predominantly working class community in Yorkshire, and we were taught about slave trade, and we were taught about it being an extraordinarily shameful episode and one of the blots on British history, and that was in the 1960s and 70s. What we probably weren't told to do was feel guilt. And probably now there's more of a sense that the white communities, indigenous communities in the UK should feel guilt. Though, as you said, there are abolitionists in our past as well as people who were slavers. How do you feel about that issue of guilt?
Well, I don't think guilt takes you anywhere. I don't think guilt takes you anywhere. It's a very negative emotion, and I certainly don't want when I talk about slavery. I certainly don't want to evoke guilt. In fact, when I was an ambassador at UNESCO, the whole issue of slavery came around, and people were, mea culpa and so on. And I said, look, what's the point of guilt? It's better to see how you can make reparations. And I didn't necessarily mean financial reparations, I meant cultural reparations. I remember one of the ambassadors said to a mutual friend, tell David to keep a bit quiet about this reparations business. But no, I don't want people to feel guilt. I want them to just acknowledge that this is part of their history in Britain, and there's a great richness to it as well. There's obviously the horrors and the nastiness, but there were people like Samuel Johnson who spent 40 years campaigning, writing about slavery, who had whose Francis Barber, his black servant, became his son, and inherited most of Johnson's estate when he died. Johnson loved Francis Barber so much that he couldn't send Francis Barber to the market to buy oysters for his cat. He thought I was demeaning Francis Barber. He toddled off on his fat legs himself to get this, So you got great people, really extraordinary people. Coleridge, for example, poet Wordsworth, Southey, the Lake District poets. It's a story that is rich as well as horrible, And I don't want people to feel guilt. I just want people to learn, just to have the narratives at their disposal.
David, we are starting to get questions in by chat, so I'd encourage everyone, please do send your questions in, use the chat function. I'm going to use the very first one from Keith Wiseman, which is a very simple question. How important is it that we act out that statement, am I not a man and a brother, rather than just arguing about it?
Well, it's a great statement, isn't it? And it's an ancient statement about you being your brother's keeper. And I find in Britain today, having lived here for 52 years, I find that we are turning a corner because of the second Black Lives Matter movement. Definitely are turning a corner. It might be a long corner, As Martin Luther King said in that famous statement he made, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I mean, I have to believe that.
But from what you said earlier, it's not good enough for Cambridge to say, well, we had some great abolitionists. I mean, you have to look at the whole picture, which includes people who benefited from the slave trade and people who were philanthropists but had based their money on slavery.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways of whitewashing your money in the 18th century, money laundering, was really to build a hospital, to fund a hospital, to build a church, or to give donations to Oxbridge. So, of course, I'm not minimizing the impact of slavery on the finances, the economics of Britain, and the way thousands and thousands and thousands of people benefited. You know what, in the 18th century, if you couldn't afford to own a slave, you can own part of a slave. You can invest in 2 legs. If a slave costs, say, 100 guineas and you only had 5 guineas, you can go to an agent and buy into the body of a slave and get from the plantation that particular slave worked on. So obviously it was horrible, and it made a lot of money. But what I want to also keep insisting is we have to remind myself and remind people that there was goodness as well. That whenever you have a advance, there's always a pushback. So I try to focus on the great human beings that lived in our community in the 18th century, and people that I used to walk down that, say King's Avenue or Grange Road or whatever, and those people walk there as well. So I feel a sense of kinship with the abolitionists, if you understand what I mean.
please keep questions coming via chat. David, I do want to talk a bit about walking down Grange Road, because you had grown up originally in Guyana. You then came to London when you were in your teens,
Yes.
spent some time in care. And I see that when you came to Selwyn, you wrote in our magazine, when you arrived, I felt socially inferior and very much an ethnic minority. But you then say, before long, those feelings were swept away by the privilege of being among exceptional undergraduates and distinguished fellows. Just tell us a little bit more about that.
I distinctly remember walking past the college and thinking, my God, Milton studied here, and Wordsworth, and your sense of social inadequacy, which was definite and understandable, being one of very few people of color in Selwyn, and not having the kind of tuxedo kind of money, not having enough to buy a dinner jacket and all that nonsense. That was swept away just by the sense of being absolutely privileged in terms of being in the company, in the shadows of people like Newton and Darwin, and Wordsworth and Milton. I mean, that in itself is enough to make you feel very, very privileged. That's what I felt. I really enjoyed two of the best years of my life were the last 2 years in Selwyn. And I just loved the privilege of going to the library and ordering a book from the 17th century or the 18th century, and it comes to me and I could read it. I mean, you can't beat that, can you?
I noticed, though, that you said in the same article that the time at which you came to Selwyn, there was racist graffiti everywhere in the UK.
Oh, yes.
Heavily booted bother boys on patrol.
Yeah,
so it was a tough environment.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who grew up in the 70s, as I did, would know that graffiti was everywhere, wogs go home, blah, blah, all of that, right? And it's very visible and everywhere. It was in your face. So that was part of, I suppose, the kind of, that's what created a sense of self-injury, if you like, or humiliation among many of us. I managed to dodge the bother boys. My friend didn't. But the violence was always a possibility. And I did get myself into a scrape once, a train, when somebody interrogated me as to why I was in the country, and I was able to slip out of it by talking about how a lot of British people are also in my country studying agriculture. I was able to lie my way out of it, to such an extent that when I left the train, he said to me, "What's your name?" It was fantastic, asking me my name. And I said, "David." And he said, "You see, you've even got our name." So you had those kinds of humiliating experiences, and you lived under the shadow of violence. No doubt about that. And what I'm saying is not anybody will say that. I saw on television yesterday a famous black actor talking about how many black people are black people are overrepresented in mental institutions and so on. So yeah, that was. But I don't dwell on that. Things have changed. Things are changing.
I was going to say, progress, if it has been progress, has been too slow. But you do think there has been progress?
Yes, I can see. I can see collaborations and alliances being made between black organizations and white organizations. I can see black people, people of color. That's what we call people of color, represented in Parliament in a major way, not symbolically, but people with their hands in the money in there and their hands in the levers of power. I can see more parliamentarians, people in the cabinet as well as in Parliament than ever before, and I can see schools responding to the Black Lives Matter by introducing black material, if I can use that term, black material, into the curriculum. My daughter is 11. On 3 floors of her school, she's in the first year in secondary school in Kingston, Kingston upon Thames, not Kingston, Jamaica. On each floor are pictures of black and Asian people who contributed to the making of modern Britain. I mean, that would never have happened. So children now are being introduced to the stuff I was talking about earlier, you know. And so are there lots of other shoots of hope. I see, for example, you can't see a television advertisement now without seeing a black person, you know. In my day, you'd be lucky to see any black person on television. So visually, it's becoming normal for black people to be people, you know, not to stand out. And of course, in my day, and probably in your day, Roger, you used to have all those nasty television programs where you used to laugh at black people, you know, it and half hot mum and stuff like that. You can't have that nonsense anymore, you know. And I'm really glad that some of our political leaders made major speeches against racism. I remember when Tony Blair was campaigning, he said it's not sufficient that you can just go and beat up some black and Indian kid. He said it's unacceptable, you know, and so on. So yes, there are many instances of things changing. I'm an optimist.
But a question from Brunel James, who says, is there not a powerful white supremacist reaction present within Britain and articulated, he says, through newspapers like The Telegraph and Spectator, who constantly refuse to engage and push back?
Yes, and I would have to agree with the anti-terrorism squad, recently issued a statement that the real threat of terrorism today in Britain is from the far right. So yes, we know our enemies, but we just have to recognize that there is this right-wing white supremacist feeling. I think it's a minority, but we just have to attend to it and be cautious about it and pay due diligence and vigilance over it.
David, we've got about 5 minutes left,
Yes.
and I've got a couple more questions that we will ask. I would just note one of the Selwyn Fellows, Jessica Gardner, who is a university librarian, she says, would love to ask David to visit us at the University Library again, and she's very interested in talking more about the concept of reparation through learning and cultural inclusion. And she says, if you've got any good examples, we'd love to hear from you.
I'd love to, please give her my email. And I'd love to connect.
Now, tell us in the last 3 or 4 minutes that we have, just tell us what you're hoping to do with the academic post at Cambridge, maybe linked with Selwyn, on indentureship.
If we can create the first professorship or lectureship in indentureship studies at an ancient great university like Cambridge, which is where it belongs really, then you're moving the subject from near invisibility to visibility. You're moving it from the margins to the center. And then indentureship becomes a proper subject of academic inquiry. It will encourage research, students, PhDs, and so on. It is a really major, it could be a really major movement in terms of creating a subject.
Martina Odonka says that's a fantastic idea. I suppose we should be honest, shouldn't we, David, that this will involve some fundraising.
Yeah, but one of my major jobs is to try to find £2.3 million to create a permanent professorship. And we're approaching British Asians who are philanthropists and other people to help us to create this this expensive project. It's expensive. This involves salaries and national insurance payments and so on. But I think it's £2.3 million for a lectureship and 3.4 million for a professorship full-time.
Okay, and so if you would like to be involved, do drop me a line at master@cell.cam.act.uk, or the development officer, Mike Nixon, will be glad to hear from you. David, as I said, we're coming towards the end of our time. I just wonder if you might want to give a final thought about Selwyn, really, and about, obviously it's wonderful for us. I should say you did go off to the University of Warwick for a rather long time, but you have now come back to us as an honorary fellow, which is terrific. And
I only discovered very recently that Selwyn, the college, the Chapel Bells Selwyn, was funded by Gladstone, the Prime Minister, who inherited his father's money. So in a sense, it was indentureship money. And if I'd known that, I certainly would have woken up in the morning go to the breakfast, but I'm having long lie. But no, I'm glad that we have this connection with Gladstone. We can convert it into something creative, basically.
And a thought actually just coming from David Denton about, I think, the fundraising, the challenge is to engage everyone and not just people of colour or British Asians. The way forward is through understanding and cooperation between cultures.
I agree completely.
Good. Well, that's a happy note to end on. And David, thank you so much for being so a terrific presentation at the beginning and answering the questions so freely and frankly and openly as well. I would like also to thank our JCR who helped to organise this. It's been lovely to have alumni on the call and current students, and we've enjoyed this event as we enjoy all our Masters Ledge and Selwyn events. So I think actually I'm seeing some comments coming in. I also think that Ryan Kinkeller, who is the JCR officer who's been helping to organise this, I think is just joining us. So I don't know whether Ryan is there and wants to materialise, but I'll just read some of the comments coming in. Richard Scott, many thanks for a wonderful discussion. Martina Odonkor, great presentation. I learned so much. And Ryan, I can see, yes, you've just arrived. So Ryan, I know you've been at a supervision. So would you just now like to say a few words on behalf of the JCR?
Yeah, I'd like to say on behalf of the JCR to David, thank you for coming here today. And I'm so sorry I missed it, but I'm pretty sure it was an amazing talk. And it will definitely be one that I'm going to go and rewatch as soon as it's up. And once again, many thanks for what has been a very informative Masters Lodge event. And I hope that also when that are attending today will agree with me.
Thanks very much, Ryan, and good luck with your studies.
Ryan, thanks so much for helping to organise. And David, there may be a name you recognise thanking you, which is Jean Chotier, saying terrific talk, yes. David.
My former tutor, supervisor. Wonderful.
Okay, so the whole family coming together. Anyway, listen, thanks again, David. Thanks to everyone who's joined us. There are more events coming up. I always say have a look at our website and social media, and we'll keep you in touch about more events. And do get in touch if you want to be involved in the project that David talked about. Thanks very much for joining us, everybody, and good night. Good night.